After a historic commission concluded the federal government was justified in invoking the Emergencies Act to end Freedom Convoy protests that, of course, had gridlocked downtown Ottawa for nearly a month. The official ruling brings the year-long saga over the unprecedented move to an end. In the report, Justice Paul Rouleau says his conclusion comes, though, with reluctance. The response, he says, was needed, however, due to policing failures and a failure of federalism.
I do not come to this conclusion easily, as I do not consider the factual basis for it to be overwhelming. Reasonable and informed people could reach a different conclusion than the one I have arrived at.
Let's be clear. We didn't want to have to invoke the Emergencies Act. It's a measure of last resort. But the risk to personal safety, the risk to livelihoods, and equally, the risk of people losing faith in the rule of law that upholds our society and our freedoms, those risks were real.
So how's the federal government responding? And could these powers be used again? Here's Justice Minister and Attorney General David Lametti. Hi, Minister Lametti. Good to have you here in studio.
Pleasure to be here.
I appreciate you making the time. Minister, I want to start off by asking if you are comfortable with the precedent that the conclusion reached by Justice Rouleau sets.
I think so. It's a difficult standard to attain. It's meant to be a difficult standard. And I think we recognize that in our deliberations, and I think Justice Rouleau recognized that as well. And I think that's important moving forward. This is meant to be an exceptional mechanism. It's meant to be a mechanism of last resort. We treated it that way. He treated it that way. I think that's the right precedent.
Did you specifically view it that way? Because I remember during testimony, it came to light that you first invoked the possibility, or rather raised the possibility of invoking it weeks before your government actually did.
As a matter of prudence, I wanted to make sure, because I knew, I have to back up 1 second, it is unfathomable to think that I would be the Attorney General who contemplated this act not once but twice. We had thought about it during the pandemic, and so as a public health emergency, and so I began to think about the standards of the act, learn the standards of the act at that point. I mentioned that in an internal text message to my Chief of Staff to say, look, we need to be ready in case we get there. There are a number of different hoops we're going to have to jump through. So that was a question of mere prudence on my part to make sure that we would be ready if we needed to be ready, but it certainly wasn't advocating, the text was clear, it certainly wasn't advocating for the invocation of the act, it was preparing.
Justice Rouleau said that he reached the conclusion that it met the threshold with reluctance because essentially, and I'm going to paraphrase this, it was the situation that led to it was sort of a failure of policing, a failure of federalism that led to circumstances that would justify the use of it. I guess when I ask, are you comfortable with that as the precedent, I wonder, in the hands of whoever forms the next government, for example, if policing doesn't work again, if the relationship between the federal government and the provinces fails Canadians again, is it okay to invoke this then?
Well, look, hopefully we won't get there. I mean, I think that's the first thing that a person should say. And hopefully all our police procedures, our federal provincial cooperation mechanisms, and all of them put together will work together in such a way that we don't get to this point again. That being said, from where I sat, sitting around the cabinet table or the incident response group, at a certain point it didn't matter how we got there. At a certain point, the only thing that mattered was rectifying the situation. We'd reached that threshold where we had to invoke the Emergencies Act. And so something had to be done, and something had to be done by the federal government.
Do you think, though, that's the intent of something as serious as what used to be known as the War Measures Act, as the Emergencies Act, to be there when the rest of the systems in place to avoid a crisis fail?
Well, I think that's right. It's meant to be the last resort. And again, I don't ever want to get there again. I hope no other government in Canadian history gets there again. I certainly hope to not be part of a government that gets there again, and will do my best working cooperatively to avoid that down the road. But once you're there and it needs to be done, then it is a legitimate tool. There are standards, there are thresholds that you need to meet, and there are procedures that you need to go through as safeguards. And I think that's the other takeaway from this report. As Justice Rouleau mentioned in his report, there's an inversion of action and deliberation. So what the Emergencies Act does is it recognizes an emergency, puts the action first and the deliberation later. We're now deliberating. His report is part of that deliberation, critical part. It's envisaged in the mechanism itself. I think that was a great mechanism from the Mulroney government at the time.
You said that hopefully you don't arrive in a position where this has to happen again. Hopefully the systems in place do work next time. As far as the idea that Justice Rouleau put forth that there was a failure in federalism, I'm not taking away from the line of accountability that needs to be directed at the provincial government in Ontario. But where do you think your government fell short?
Well, again, I don't want to point fingers at any government or our government. We could have done things better. I suppose I think the point here is we might have cooperated better. The Prime Minister himself admitted that he had made certain comments at the outset.
Were you disappointed at those comments? I think you're referencing what Justice Rouleau talked about in his report, which is when the Prime Minister referred to people protesting, certain elements of them, as a fringe minority. He said that inflamed the protesters and further embittered them toward government authorities.
Yeah, I think the Prime Minister qualified that well and expressed,
a year later,
and expressed regret. He was targeting a very small group of people, and in the manner in which he framed his comments, he caught a larger group of people who really wanted to legitimately protest their opposition to certain of our government's policies, particularly on vaccine mandates. But even Justice Rouleau pointed out himself that all of that converged in one place and got out of hand. So I think there's certainly better ways to communicate. Justice Rouleau mentioned that there was a certain disappointment in not having outreach with the protesters. All of these things are things for hindsight that we can perhaps do better next time.
Would you, if you look back, have done any of that outreach with protesters? And I'm not in framing that question trying to excuse the elements that were condoning violence, for example, or blocking the bridge, or blocking people in downtown Ottawa from going about their day-to-day life. But what Justice Rouleau did capture was that even people who just disagreed with your government and felt like showing up here to peacefully protest that, they felt dismissed, right? They felt, and then their anger grew as a result. The Prime Minister took a really long time to make the reflection that he did. He actually doubled down on it in many instances I heard him do in the years since. Could that reflection have happened and that regret have happened sooner? And should your government have maybe not polarized those people to the degree you did?
Well, look, it was difficult to identify who the leaders were. There were a number of different challenges there. I think the better answer is to move forward and to say, next time around, if this ever happened again, we'll take the lessons from Justice Rouleau and we'll look for other ways or other opportunities to achieve those levels of communication or cooperation.
Do you agree with the assessment from Justice Rouleau, though, that politicians involved in this did not rise above politics? And isn't that serious for Canadians?
Well, I think there were moments, but I think at the end of the day, the federal government did, by invoking the Act, assume the leadership role that it had to assume, given where the situation was. At the outset, at the federal level, we were a bit hamstrung by jurisdiction, and we reached a certain point where we had to take jurisdiction through the Emergencies Act. I do think we acted in good faith throughout as a federal government. We did our best, given imperfect information, given imperfect knowledge, and given a rapidly evolving situation.
I just have literally 10 seconds left, but how soon might your government make a decision on whether or not you'll act on the recommendations, and which ones?
Well, we have a year.
Will you take that full year?
I suspect we will look at it carefully, prudently, cautiously. The Prime Minister said that we would have a emergency preparation program within 6 months as called for in the report.
Okay, Minister, I'll leave it there. Thanks for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.